What is the Parsha this Shabbat? Chayei Sarah. This Shabbat is Chayei Sarah. It begins with Abraham's wife Sarah actually dying. And yet, it's not a tribute to death, but rather to life. Chayei Sarah. So Rabbi Jonathan Sacks of blessed memory is quoted as saying, first, build the future. Only then can you mourn the past. Think about that. First, build the future. Only then can you mourn the past. Abraham knew a lot of loss and a lot of frustration in his life, but he never gave up his hope or his faith. Faith in God, faith in a future that was laid out before him as what was meant to be. He dies at 175, we should all be so lucky, and his wife, Sarah, when he was 137. At a point when most of what had been promised by God had not yet happened. How many of you have waited and waited and waited for promises that have been made to actually be fulfilled and then ever got frustrated while you're waiting? Either in the case that maybe the promises were broken. Has anyone ever experienced broken promises? Or maybe those promises never materialized. Anybody experienced that? It's not that they were broken, they just didn't manifest in any way or at all. Maybe not even in the promise itself, and you felt that the promise should be there. Or that maybe the wait seemed at times more than you could ever bear. Abraham had one son with Sarah very late in life, and then what happened? We talk about this, we read it every High Holy Days. He was asked by God to sacrifice him, by the very God who promised him that his descendants would be more numerous than all the stars in the sky. Sometimes the promise just doesn't actually materialize on the timetable that we wish it to. Thousands and thousands and thousands of years later, look at how many of us came to be. And yet, for Abraham, this was not something that he could readily see, and still he continued to believe. What Abraham does in this parsha is he takes care of business. He doesn't become paralyzed by his grief. He gets to work. He secures a burial site for Sarah in the caves of Machpelah. We were there when we went to Israel last time. And a wife for his son Isaac. Of this, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks of blessed memory states, Abraham had every reason to sit and grieve, to become absolutely paralyzed. Yet, he did not. In one of the most extraordinary sequences of words in the Torah, his grief is described in a mere 5 Hebrew words in English. Abraham came to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. Then, immediately we read, and Abraham rose from his grief. From then on, he engaged in a flurry of activity with 2 aims in mind. First, to buy a plot of land in which to bury Sarah. Second, to find a wife for his son corresponding precisely to the 2 divine blessings and promises that he received from God, promises of land and descendants. Abraham did not wait for God to act. He understood one of the profoundest truths of Judaism, that God is waiting for us to act. Rabbi Sacks looks to find an answer as to how one goes forward after extraordinary grief, looking to Holocaust survivors for the answer. Discovering that most of them didn't talk about the past, even to their marriage partners or their children. What did they do? They set about creating a new life in a new land. They learned its language and its customs. They found work. They built careers. They married and they had children. Having lost their own families, they also became very connected to the survivors as an extended family to one another. They looked forward and not back. First, they built a future. Only then, sometimes 40 or 50 years later, then they spoke about the past. That was when they told their story, first to their families, then to the world. First, you have to build a future. Only then you can mourn the past. Rabbi Sachs goes on to cite two people in our ancestry who did look back. You might know who they are. Anyone? Torah scholars? Noah. He was devastated with grief. Couldn't get it out of his being of all had perished, all of the lives that had been lost in the flood, even when he was an instrument for the future salvation of humanity. He couldn't get past his grief. Lot's wife, remember the story of Lot? She was warned by the angels, don't look back. Do not look back. And what does she do? She looks back, and what happens to her? She turns into a pillar of salt. She was so overwhelmed by shock and grief as to be unable to move on. When we are feeling broken by despair, our Judaic system provides the formula for repair of our heart and our spirit. Funerals at burial sites or memorial celebrations of life, sitting Shiva, 11 months of saying Kaddish if you're traditional, mourning, and then what do? We move on. We unveil the marker of our beloved to signify our desperate longing for the departed, and that showing we marked the time between loss and life, going forward to live fully so they can too, so that they can go on through us. We have experienced so much of this, so much loss as a temple family, and we will continue to experience this desperate longing for those who have moved on, the departed. And the important thing to remember is that we're not alone. God is with us, especially in the struggle and in the loss and in this beautiful community that we have, this extended family, the love that we have with each other. Rabbi Sachs goes on to state, Abraham heard the future calling to him. Sarah had died. Isaac was unmarried. Abraham had neither land or grandchildren. Many children, all of us. He didn't cry out. He didn't cry out in anger or anguish to God. He was lucky enough to have Isaac, but what was he going to do? How was he going to get his grandchildren if he didn't get married? How was he going to be fruitful and multiply? He was already lost his wife and he was already so old. He didn't cry out. He didn't whine. He didn't complain. Instead, what happened? Everything we say at the Shema, he heard that still, small voice saying, the next step depends on you. You must create a future that I will fill up with my spirit. That is how Abraham survived his shock and his grief. This is why Chayei Sarah is a parsha devoted not to death, but to life, even though it begins with a death. The best way to honor those we love is to keep on living. This may seem easy to say, but it is so hard to do. How many have been through this? David Kessler, a grief and loss expert, says, no feeling is final. Don't stop at 500 tears when you have 2,000 tears to cry. This is the one I really love. Buffaloes run right into the storm, right straight into the center of it. Why? To lessen their period of time in stormy chaos. They just go right through. And that is what we're meant to do. Go right through it, toward the future, right through it, so that then we can look back and mourn, but then we can live fully. And to not be afraid to make a direct ask for help. This is what he says. Ask for help with no shame. Just make the ask. How many of you have experienced love and loss so great that moving forward at times seemed unthinkable? Maybe even you're filled with a little guilt, let alone be a doable thing. There's so many mixed emotions that go on. But as time goes on and we go forward, looking back, we see that we have come through it. That sad emptiness, it may still be there at our sense of loss, but time continues to march on with or without us. It still keeps ticking. We will always carry our loved ones inside of us as we move forward. The important thing is to figure out what future we can get down to business and build. And it seems so bizarre, doesn't it, to think you're grieving, you're in this horrible state. How could you go forward and think about building a future? But this is what we need to try to focus on. Where might our energies be placed so that we can begin to feel rejuvenated and fulfilled? What can we build? Where can we build? So that the future can be filled with promise, so that when we look back, we see that it was filled with blessing. Each and every one of us illuminated and blessed by the knowledge that we kept going. We continued to take care of business, contributing and living in a way that our loved ones would be proud. And God, too, blessed on high our loved ones as well, because we created a future that God could fill with His or her Spirit. And because we took action, knowing that the next step did depend on us, that we needed to be proactive for the blessing to be able to follow, and so too, the promises fulfilled. As we go forward with our lives, may we have the courage, the fortitude, and the faith of Abraham when most at a loss. And may we lean on one another, lean on our rituals and our God as we gather up the strength to move forward, meriting the right to look back. Ken Yehu Ratzon, may this be God's will. Shabbat Shalom.